December 7, 1941, the morning Pearl Harbor burned, changed everything about how America thought of war, but few could have predicted it would validate the obsessive genius of one stubborn aircraft designer named Leroy Grumman. While Japanese bombs tore through Battleship Row, a peculiar torpedo bomber sitting on drawing boards back in Bethpage, New York, represented everything the Navy brass considered wrong with modern aircraft design. Too complex, too heavy, too expensive, and fitted with innovations that seemed to solve problems nobody had asked about. The Grumman TBF Avenger, as it would come to be known, carried more moving parts than any carrier plane before it, featured a bomb bay that swallowed torpedoes whole rather than carrying them externally, and boasted a bizarre rotating turret that added hundreds of pounds to an already overweight frame. Leroy Grumman had founded his company just 11 years earlier, in 1930, after growing frustrated with his employer's reluctance to embrace his radical ideas about naval aviation. The son of a carriage maker, Grumman possessed an engineer's mind trapped in an era of transition. He understood that carrier warfare would define the Pacific conflict before most admirals had even accepted that battleships might become obsolete. His previous designs, the stubby F-4F Wildcat fighter and the rotund F-3F biplane, had earned grudging respect for their ruggedness, but the Avenger represented something different entirely. This was a designer declaring that complexity, if engineered correctly, could become reliability. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had issued specification requirements for a new torpedo bomber in 1939, and 8 companies submitted proposals. Most designed straightforward aircraft that carried torpedoes beneath their fuselages in the traditional manner, exposed to wind resistance and vulnerable to damage during carrier landings. Grumman's team proposed something audacious: an internal weapons bay, powered folding wings, and a defensive armament suite that turned a supposedly vulnerable torpedo bomber into a flying fortress. When the mock-up review board first examined the XTBF-1 prototype in November 1940, one admiral reportedly called it magnificently overcomplicated. The comment was not intended as praise, yet Grumman had calculated something his critics missed. Torpedo bombers, historically, died in horrifying numbers. The lumbering aircraft made easy targets as they descended to wave-top altitude to release their weapons. The Douglas TBD Devastator, the Navy's current torpedo bomber, had performed adequately in peacetime, but combat would soon reveal its tragic inadequacies. Grumman designed the Avenger to survive what killed other torpedo bombers. He added armor plating around the crew compartment, installed self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when punctured, and created a defensive position that gave the radio man a powered turret rather than a handheld machine gun. The first production TBF-1 rolled off the assembly line in January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor transformed America's industrial base into a weapons factory. According to Aviation History magazine's analysis published decades later, Grumman's factory in Bethpage produced aircraft at a rate that seemed impossible. The company had employed 400 people in 1940. By mid-1942, nearly 25,000 workers swarmed 3 shifts around the clock. The Avenger they built would soon face its baptism by fire in a battle that would determine the Pacific War's trajectory, and its designer's controversial choices would either be vindicated or condemned by the most unforgiving judge. Combat. June 4, 1942 arrived with destiny aboard the USS Hornet, steaming somewhere northeast of Midway Atoll with 6 brand new Avengers in her belly. The only TBFs in the entire Pacific theater. Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling commanded Torpedo Squadron 8's detachment. 6 crews who had barely 3 weeks of training in aircraft, so new that technical manuals were still being written. These men would take America's most sophisticated torpedo bomber into combat against Japan's carrier strike force, the same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. What happened next would haunt the Avenger's reputation for months, yet paradoxically proved every controversial design decision Grumman had made. The battle began before dawn, with American scout planes locating Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier fleet. Fieberling received orders to launch immediately, despite being over 150 miles from the enemy, beyond the Avenger's comfortable combat radius with a torpedo load. Naval doctrine called for coordinated strikes with fighter escort, but the chaotic nature of Midway's defense meant the 6 Avengers would attack alone, unescorted, against the 4 carriers that represented Japan's elite naval aviation. As Fieberling's formation droned toward the enemy, Zero fighters from the Combat Air Patrol spotted them 40 miles out. What followed tested every engineering choice Grumman had made. The Zeros swarmed the Avengers like hornets, their 20mm cannons hammering the big torpedo bombers from multiple angles simultaneously. In any other aircraft of that era, the attack would have resulted in 6 quick kills. The old Devastators had proven horrifyingly vulnerable at Coral Sea weeks earlier. But Grumman's armor plating absorbed punishment that would have shredded lesser planes. His self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that typically turned aircraft into coffins. The powered turret allowed radio men to track the swift Japanese fighters, creating zones of defensive fire that occasionally forced Zeros to break off attacks. Yet superiority of engineering could not overcome impossible odds. 5 of the 6 Avengers fell during the attack run or immediately after. Fieberling's aircraft disappeared into the Pacific along with 9 other crewmen. Only Ensign Albert Ernest's TBF survived to limp back to Midway, and the aircraft told a remarkable story. Mechanics counted over 60 bullet and cannon holes in the fuselage. The hydraulic system had been destroyed, forcing Ernest to hand-crank the landing gear down. The turret gunner, radio man 3rd Class Harry Ferrier, had been wounded but kept fighting until the Zeros finally broke off. The ventral gunner had been killed at his position. Naval intelligence officers photographed Ernest's Avenger extensively, and those images would later prove crucial. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives and referenced in John Lundstrom's comprehensive study, The First Team, engineers examining the damage realized that any other torpedo bomber in American inventory would have disintegrated under such punishment. The armor had stopped rounds that penetrated the fuselage from reaching the crew compartment. The self-sealing tanks had prevented fire despite multiple punctures. The structural strength of Grumman's overcomplicated design had held together when simpler, lighter aircraft would have shed wings or tail surfaces. The Navy's initial assessment of Midway considered the Avenger's debut a failure. 5 losses from 6 aircraft represented an 83% casualty rate. Newspaper reports that Summer barely mentioned the TBF, focusing instead on the dive bombers that had sunk 4 Japanese carriers. But pilots and crews who flew the Avenger drew different conclusions. They had witnessed the old Devastators being massacred at Midway. Torpedo Squadron 8's other detachment, flying TBDs from Hornet, lost all 15 aircraft with only 1 survivor. The Devastator's combat career effectively ended that day, never to fly another attack mission. The Avenger, bloodied but validated, was just beginning its war. October 26, 1942 found the Pacific Fleet's carrier groups hunting each other near the Santa Cruz Islands, and the Avenger would finally demonstrate the offensive capability Grumman had promised. 7 months of brutal combat had transformed the TBF from a controversial experiment into the Navy's primary torpedo bomber, with production expanding beyond Grumman's capacity. General Motors had begun building identical aircraft designated TBM at a massive new factory in Trenton, New Jersey. The Battle of Santa Cruz would prove whether complexity could translate into lethality. Commander John Crommelin led Enterprise's Air Group 10 into the attack that morning, with 12 Avengers forming the torpedo element. Unlike the desperate, uncoordinated strikes at Midway, this assault featured the coordination that made carrier aviation devastating, fighters clearing the way, dive bombers attacking from high altitude, and torpedo bombers approaching from multiple angles simultaneously. The target was the carrier Zuiho, steaming with her escorts at flank speed, her deck crews frantically preparing to launch another strike. The Avengers descended to 200 feet above the wave tops, their bombardiers arming the Mark 13 torpedoes that had been unreliable in early war months but now performed with increasing consistency. Grumman's internal bomb bay design proved its worth during these attacks. External torpedo mounts created massive drag and instability, forcing aircraft into slow, vulnerable approach runs. The Avenger's bay doors opened cleanly, released the weapon without disturbing the aircraft's flight characteristics, and closed immediately, allowing pilots to execute violent evasive maneuvers instantly after dropping. Lieutenant Harold Bottomley's crew scored a hit on Zuiho that tore through her stern, destroying steering equipment and forcing the carrier out of action for months. 2 other Avengers claimed possible hits, Though battle damage assessment in the chaotic engagement remained uncertain, the returning crews told stories that began shifting naval aviation's understanding of what torpedo bombers could accomplish. Several Avengers had been intercepted by Zeros during retirement, yet the formations fought their way clear using coordinated defensive fire from the turrets. The powered rotation allowed gunners to track faster than handheld weapons permitted. One TBF returned with its ventral gun position shot away entirely, the radio man dead, but the pilot and turret gunner unhurt behind armor plating that had stopped multiple 20mm rounds. Another came back with 3 feet of one wingtip missing from a ramming attempt by a damaged Zero, yet the structural integrity held sufficiently for a carrier landing. Statistical analysis conducted by the Navy's Operational Research Group, later cited in research published through the Naval War College, revealed patterns emerging from these early battles. Avengers attacking in coordinated groups with fighter support achieved hit rates between 15 and 20%, remarkably high for aerial torpedo attacks. More significantly, their survival rate exceeded 70% in coordinated strikes, compared to catastrophic losses suffered by earlier torpedo bombers. The complexity Grumman had built into the design translated directly into combat effectiveness. Crews survived to gain experience, experienced crews scored more hits, and the cycle reinforced itself. Yet the Avenger remained controversial in certain circles. Army Air Force observers committed to their doctrine of high-altitude strategic bombing considered the entire concept of torpedo bombing obsolete. Why risk low-altitude attacks when bombs could be dropped from 20,000 feet? The debate raged through 1942's final months, even as Avenger squadrons quietly accumulated kills. They sank the submarine I-15 off Guadalcanal in November, destroyed numerous transport vessels during the brutal campaign for that island, and began demonstrating versatility that exceeded their designed role. December 19, 1942, brought an innovation that would redefine the Avenger's purpose. Commander William Martin's squadron tested the TBF carrying depth charges instead of torpedoes, hunting Japanese submarines that stalked the convoy routes between Pearl Harbor and the South Pacific bases. The internal bomb bay, designed for torpedoes, accommodated the smaller depth charges perfectly while allowing modifications that included radar equipment in a pod beneath the wing. Grumman's overcomplicated design had accidentally created the most adaptable strike aircraft in the Navy's inventory, capable of anti-submarine warfare, anti-shipping strikes, close air support, and even night operations with appropriate equipment modifications. March 15, 1943, marked the beginning of the Avenger's transformation from controversial torpedo bomber into the most lethal anti-submarine weapon in naval history, a role its designer never imagined, but the aircraft's complexity made inevitable. Lieutenant Commander William Drain's squadron, operating from escort carriers protecting Atlantic convoys, had received TBFs modified with ASV radar, searchlights, and rocket rails, turning Grumman's heavy torpedo bomber into a submarine hunter capable of operating in darkness and foul weather. The Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats were strangling Britain's supply lines, would become the unexpected proving ground for innovations that complexity enabled. The Germans had refined wolfpack tactics to devastating effect through 1942, with submarine groups coordinating attacks on convoys at night, surfacing to use superior surface speed to outrun escorts, then diving before dawn. Traditional anti-submarine aircraft lacked the sensor suite and endurance to counter these tactics effectively. The Avenger, however, possessed both the range for extended patrols and the structural capacity to carry radar equipment without compromising performance. Grumman's overbuilt airframe, criticized for being too heavy, now proved advantageous. It could absorb modifications that would have overwhelmed lighter designs. Drain's squadron scored their first confirmed U-boat kill on March 23, when Ensign Robert Farley's TBF detected U-524 surfacing to charge batteries 60 miles from convoy HX-230. The ASV radar picked up the submarine's silhouette in darkness, allowing Farley to position for attack before the U-boat crew knew aircraft were present. The Avenger's internal bay disgorged 4 depth charges in a precise pattern that straddled the diving submarine, the detonations rupturing pressure hull seams and sending U-524 to the bottom with all hands. According to records maintained by the U-boat archive in Germany and referenced in Clay Blair's comprehensive history, Hitler's U-boat war. This kill represented the first of many that would establish the Avenger as the deadliest anti-submarine aircraft deployed by any nation. The technical evolution continued throughout 1943. Engineers installed forward-firing rockets that allowed Avengers to attack surface submarines before they could dive. 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that turned the TBF into a precision strike platform. The powered turret received modifications allowing it to depress lower, covering the aircraft's vulnerable belly during low-altitude attacks. Most significantly, the radio compartment was reconfigured to accommodate a dedicated radar operator, creating a 3-man crew optimized for submarine hunting rather than torpedo attacks. Grumman's original overcomplicated design accommodated these modifications because he had built in structural margins and electrical capacity that seemed excessive in 1941 but proved prescient in combat. By June 1943, composite squadrons operating from escort carriers had refined tactics that made U-boat operations increasingly suicidal. Avengers patrolled convoy perimeters around the clock, their radar sweeping for surface contacts while destroyers prosecuted sonar contacts below. The German submariners called it the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft couldn't reach but carrier-based Avengers now operated with impunity. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding Germany's submarine force, began reporting unsustainable losses to Hitler, with boats being sunk faster than shipyards could replace them. The statistics told a story that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Between March and September 1943, Avenger squadrons operating in the Atlantic were credited with sinking or severely damaging 31 German submarines, more than any other single aircraft type. The kill-to-loss ratio exceeded 20-1. For every Avenger lost to enemy action, more than 20 U-boats were destroyed. This performance ratio, documented in official Navy records and analyzed in post-war studies, exceeded that of the celebrated dive bombers and fighters that received more publicity. The overcomplicated torpedo bomber had become the most cost-effective killer in the Navy's arsenal. September 9, 1943, brought perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of the Avengers' submarine hunting prowess, when Commander Francis Hodges' squadron cornered and destroyed 3 U-boats from Wolfpack Leuthen in a single day's operations. Using tactics refined through months of combat, Avengers worked in coordinated pairs, with one aircraft maintaining radar contact while the second attacked with depth charges and rockets. The U-boats, attempting to concentrate against convoy on 202, found themselves hunted by aircraft that could detect them in darkness, attack before they dove, and pursue relentlessly until fuel exhaustion forced rotation with fresh Avengers from the escort carriers. January 18, 1944, found the Avenger returning to its designed element as American forces began the island-hopping campaign that would carry the war toward Japan's home waters. The Marshall Islands operation, targeting Kwajalein Atoll, showcased how 2 years of combat evolution had transformed the TBF into a weapon system that exceeded original specifications in every measurable category. Commander Robert Isley led the strike from Essex, with 18 Avengers configured for a new mission profile that demonstrated the aircraft's remarkable adaptability, close air support for amphibious landings. The Marines assaulting Kwajalein's beaches needed immediate air support to suppress Japanese bunkers and artillery positions that traditional naval gunfire couldn't neutralize. Avengers, carrying bombs instead of torpedoes, operated in a role more typically assigned to dive bombers, but with crucial advantages. The TBF's long endurance allowed it to loiter over beaches for hours, immediately available when ground controllers called for strikes. The internal bomb bay could carry a devastating load of general-purpose bombs, or more effectively, new napalm canisters that incinerated fortified positions. The heavy construction that made the Avenger seem overweight now allowed it to absorb anti-aircraft fire that would down lighter aircraft, pressing attacks through flak that forced other planes to break off. Isley's pilots developed tactics that became doctrine for subsequent operations. Rather than high-altitude bombing with its inherent inaccuracy, Avengers descended to 500 feet, using the turret gunner to suppress ground fire, while the pilot lined up on targets marked by Marine forward air controllers. The bomb bay doors could open and close in 2 seconds, minimizing drag during evasive maneuvers. Multiple Avengers would work a target area systematically, with one aircraft attacking while others circled at staggered altitudes, creating a continuous rain of ordnance that Japanese defenders found psychologically devastating. The results exceeded expectations dramatically. Post-battle assessment, documented in Operation Flintlock's after-action reports preserved at the National Archives, credited Avenger close air support with reducing Marine casualties by an estimated 40% compared to earlier landings. The aircraft's ability to respond within minutes to support requests, deliver precision strikes on fortifications, and remain on station until ammunition exhausted created a new paradigm for amphibious warfare. General Holland Smith, commanding the Marine forces, reportedly told Admiral Raymond Spruance that the Avengers had been more valuable than an entire artillery battalion. This success drove further modifications that seemed to vindicate every controversial design choice Grumman had made. Engineers developed rocket rails that allowed Avengers to carry 8 5-inch rockets in addition to bomb bay loads, creating devastating firepower. The turret received upgraded 50 caliber machine guns with increased ammunition capacity. Most significantly, the TBF-1C variant introduced wing-mounted 20mm cannons that transformed the torpedo bomber into an effective strafer, capable of shredding Japanese aircraft on the ground or destroying small vessels and coastal targets. May 7, 1944 brought the Avenger full circle when Commander James Ramage's squadron from Enterprise struck Japanese shipping in Truk Lagoon, using torpedoes against anchored vessels in the raid that effectively ended Truk's usefulness as a fleet base. The attack demonstrated how combat experience had refined torpedo tactics to devastating effectiveness. Avengers approached from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing defenders to split anti-aircraft fire. They released torpedoes at optimal range with spread patterns that made evasion impossible for anchored ships. The hit rate exceeded 50%, extraordinary for aerial torpedo attacks, sinking 6 vessels including 2 tankers and a destroyer. The kill ratio data emerging from Pacific operations began attracting attention from operational analysts trying to measure combat effectiveness. According to metrics compiled by the Naval Operational Research Group, by mid-1944, the Avenger had been credited with destroying or significantly damaging 237 Japanese vessels, 21 submarines, and approximately 300 aircraft, either in air combat or on the ground. The aircraft's own losses, while substantial in absolute numbers, represented a casualty rate below 15%, meaning more than 85% of Avengers survived their combat missions. For comparison, early war torpedo bombers suffered loss rates exceeding 50%. More remarkably, when analysts calculated kill-per-aircraft lost ratios, the Avenger exceeded every other American combat aircraft, including celebrated fighters and dive bombers. For every TBF lost to enemy action, an average of 12 enemy ships, submarines, or aircraft were destroyed. The overcomplicated design that admirals had questioned in 1940 had become the most cost-effective weapons platform in the Pacific War, vindicating Grumman's obsessive attention to survivability and versatility. August 3, 1944 introduced another dimension of Avenger operations that would have seemed fantastical when the aircraft first flew: carrier-based night strikes against Japanese shipping and island installations. Lieutenant Commander William Martin, who had pioneered daytime anti-submarine tactics, now commanded the Navy's first dedicated night carrier squadron, flying TBF-1s modified with advanced radar, enhanced instrument lighting, and training that pushed crews into operational envelopes no previous generation of naval aviators had attempted. The invasion of the Marianas provided the perfect testing ground for tactics that complexity made possible. Night carrier operations represented aviation's most demanding challenge. Pilots had to launch from pitching decks in darkness, navigate by instruments to distant targets, locate and attack enemies without visual reference, then return to find a carrier blacked out except for brief moments when landing signals were given. The Navy had attempted night operations earlier in the war with disastrous results: aircraft lost, pilots killed in landing accidents, missions abandoned due to navigation failures. The Avenger, however, possessed characteristics that made it uniquely suited for these missions, despite never being designed for them. Grumman's overcomplicated design included instrument redundancy that seemed excessive in daylight operations, but proved essential at night. Dual attitude indicators, backup compass systems, and comprehensive engine instrumentation allowed pilots to maintain control when visual reference disappeared. The three-man crew distributed workload effectively, pilot flying the aircraft, bombardier navigator managing radar and weapons systems, radio man monitoring communications, and providing another set of eyes during critical phases. The internal bomb bay meant ordnance could be carried without the external drag that made night formation flying even more hazardous. Martin's squadron struck Saipan's harbor facilities on August 10th, their first fully coordinated night attack, and the results validated months of training. 6 Avengers launched at 2200 hours, climbed to altitude in formation, using only position lights dimmed to barely visible intensity, and proceeded to target using radar navigation. Over Saipan, the radar operator in each aircraft identified vessels and structures, guiding pilots to attack positions. They descended individually, released bombs at calculated points based on radar returns, and climbed away while Japanese searchlights swept uselessly through empty sky. All 6 aircraft returned safely, claiming hits on 2 cargo vessels and a fuel depot that burned for 3 days. The tactical advantage proved overwhelming. Japanese forces, already stretched thin by years of attrition, lacked night fighter capability and relied on anti-aircraft fire that required visual acquisition. Avengers attacking in darkness could strike with near impunity, their only significant risk being navigation errors or landing accidents. Through August and September 1944, Night Avenger squadrons flew increasingly ambitious missions, interdicting supply convoys, destroying airfields, even conducting reconnaissance deep into Japanese-held territory where daylight missions would have been suicidal. By October 1944, as the Navy prepared for the Philippines invasion, night-capable Avenger squadrons operated from multiple carriers, conducting round-the-clock operations that gave Japanese forces no respite. According to analysis published in the Naval Institute's proceedings after the war, this capability contributed significantly to American victory at Leyte Gulf. Night searches by Avengers located Admiral Kurita's center force after it had transited San Bernardino Strait, allowing positioning of American carriers for the decisive engagement. The same aircraft that had been considered too complex now demonstrated that complexity enabled capabilities impossible with simpler designs. The technological evolution continued accelerating. Engineers installed AN/APS-4 radar that provided crude but functional surface search capability, allowing Avengers to locate ships in complete darkness or through weather that grounded other aircraft. They experimented with primitive infrared detection gear, attempting to locate vessels by their heat signatures. Most significantly, they developed cooperative tactics between night-flying Avengers and destroyers equipped with new radar systems, creating hunter-killer teams that devastated Japanese coastal traffic. December 11, 1944, brought perhaps the most dramatic vindication of night operations when Lieutenant Commander John Phillips' squadron intercepted a Japanese reinforcement convoy bound for Ormoc Bay in the Philippines. 8 Avengers, flying in darkness through tropical squalls, located the convoy using radar, coordinated attacks that sank 4 transports and 2 destroyers, and returned to their carrier without loss. The Japanese Army troops aboard those transports, an entire regiment, went to the bottom, never reaching the defenders they were meant to reinforce. The strategic impact of 8 aircraft exceeded that of many larger daylight raids, all because Grumman's overcomplicated design could accommodate the sensors and systems that made such missions feasible. February 19, 1945, the morning Marines stormed ashore at Iwo Jima, found Avengers demonstrating their ultimate evolution as the Navy's primary strike aircraft. Commander Harold Funk led Air Group 10 from Intrepid, with 36 TBFs configured for a mission profile that incorporated every lesson learned through 3 years of brutal combat. The target was not Japanese shipping or submarines, but concrete and steel, the fortifications on Mount Suribachi that dominated Iwo Jima's southern beaches with interlocking fields of fire that threatened to turn the amphibious assault into massacre. The Avengers that attacked that morning barely resembled the aircraft that had debuted at Midway. They carried 5-inch rockets, 1,000-pound bombs with variable time fuses designed to detonate inside fortifications, and wing-mounted cannons loaded with armor, piercing ammunition. The 3-man crews had refined coordination to a level approaching telepathy. Pilots maneuvered based on target information from bombardiers, while turret gunners suppressed anti-aircraft positions identified during the attack run. This was combined arms warfare compressed into individual aircraft, each TBF functioning as a self-contained weapons platform, delivering firepower that rivaled artillery batteries. Funk's strike approached Suribachi from the north at wave-top altitude, using the island itself as a radar shield until the last moment. At 2 miles out, the formation climbed sharply to 2,000 feet, rolled inverted to acquire targets visually, then plunged toward specific bunkers and gun emplacements marked by Marine spotters during pre-dawn reconnaissance. The attack sequence lasted 90 seconds of controlled violence. Rockets fired at 200 feet, followed immediately by bombs released at 400 feet, then cannon fire as aircraft pulled up and away through Japanese anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a steel curtain. The fortifications absorbed tremendous punishment, but Japanese engineers had built them to withstand naval bombardment. Several bunkers required multiple strikes, with Avengers making repeated passes despite intensifying ground fire. Lieutenant Robert Chadwick's TBF took an anti-aircraft shell through the bomb bay that detonated remaining ordnance, yet Grumman's structural over-engineering kept the aircraft together long enough for Chadwick to ditch successfully offshore where destroyers retrieved his crew. This was the combat reality that validated every pound of armor, every redundant system, every overcomplicated mechanism that critics had questioned. These design choices translated directly into saved lives. The Iwo Jima campaign became the ultimate demonstration of the Avengers' versatility and lethality. Between February 19th and March 26th, when the island was finally secured, TBF squadrons flew over 4,000 combat sorties delivering close air support. They operated in every weather condition, often when other aircraft were grounded. They attacked point targets with precision impossible for naval gunfire or high-altitude bombers. They absorbed battle damage that would have destroyed any other aircraft type, while completing missions that directly saved Marine lives on the ground. Statistical analysis conducted by the Operational Research Group assigned to 5th Fleet, preserved in Navy archives, calculated that Avenger close air support reduced Marine casualties at Iwo Jima by an estimated 35%, compared to projections based on earlier campaigns without equivalent air support. This translated to approximately 8,000 Marines who survived battles they statistically should have died in, solely because overhead protection from Avengers suppressed Japanese defensive positions at critical moments. The implications were staggering. The controversial aircraft that Admiral had called magnificently overcomplicated had become the most important factor in amphibious warfare, more valuable than any other weapon system including naval artillery. April 7th, 1945, brought the Avengers' greatest single-day performance during the Operation Tengo counterstrike, when Japan's super battleship Yamato sortied on a one-way mission toward Okinawa. Commander Frederick Schrader led the torpedo element from Bennington, coordinating with dive bombers from multiple carriers for the massive strike that would destroy history's largest battleship. The attack demonstrated how profoundly doctrine had evolved. Rather than the chaotic, uncoordinated attacks of early war, this strike featured precise timing, multiple approach angles, and coordinated release that overwhelmed Yamato's formidable defenses. Schrader's Avengers approached from 4 directions simultaneously, forcing Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries to engage threats from multiple vectors. They released torpedoes at the optimal range Grumman had originally specified, 1,800 yards, close enough for accuracy but distant enough to allow evasion after release. According to Japanese survivor accounts collected by interrogators after the war, at least 8 torpedoes struck Yamato, ripping massive holes below the waterline that flooding pumps could not overcome. The battleship capsized and exploded, taking 2,700 men with her. The torpedo bombers that had been nearly written off after Midway had just killed the most powerful warship ever built. Part 8. Legacy of Complexity. August 15th, 1945. Japan's surrender announcement found the Grumman Avenger having compiled the most extraordinary combat record of any American aircraft in World War II, yet remaining largely unknown outside naval aviation circles. While newspapers celebrated fighter aces and strategic bomber crews, the TBF crews had quietly revolutionized carrier warfare, anti-submarine operations, and close air support through missions that rarely generated headlines but consistently generated results that changed battles' outcomes. The final accounting of the Avengers War would validate every controversial choice Leroy Grumman made when he designed an aircraft that seemed magnificently overcomplicated. The statistics told a story that military historians would analyze for decades. Between June 1942 and August 1945, Avengers had been credited with sinking 1 Japanese battleship, 1 fleet carrier, 2 light carriers, 13 cruisers, 39 destroyers, and approximately 300 cargo vessels and transports, more tonnage than all other U.S. Navy aircraft types combined. In anti-submarine warfare, TBFs accounted for 63 German U-boats and 31 Japanese submarines destroyed, again exceeding all other aircraft. The kill-per-aircraft lost ratio stood at 12.4 to 1 overall, reaching peaks of 20 to 1 during anti-submarine operations. These numbers, documented in official Navy records and comprehensively analyzed in Barrett Tillman's definitive history, Avenger at War, represented unprecedented combat effectiveness. The aircraft that critics considered too complex had proved that thoughtful complexity created capability. Every system Grumman added, the armor plating, self-sealing tanks, powered turret, internal bomb bay, redundant instruments, translated into either enhanced lethality or improved survivability. The design philosophy of over-engineering for worst-case scenarios meant Avengers consistently performed in conditions that grounded simpler aircraft. More significantly, the Avengers' adaptability proved Grumman's core insight, that complexity properly managed created versatility. The same airframe served effectively as torpedo bomber, dive bomber, level bomber, night attack aircraft, anti-submarine patrol plane, reconnaissance platform, and close air support striker. No other World War II aircraft operated successfully in such varied roles. This versatility meant that carriers could accomplish multiple mission types with a single aircraft type, simplifying logistics, training, and maintenance while increasing combat flexibility. The human dimension proved equally important. Avenger crews developed legendary esprit de corps based on trust in their aircraft's ability to bring them home. 3-man crews created social bonds and operational effectiveness that single-seat fighters couldn't replicate. Veterans consistently reported that knowing their aircraft would absorb punishment and keep flying allowed them to press attacks longer and take necessary risks. The psychological advantage of confidence in equipment translated directly into tactical aggressiveness that gave American forces initiative. Leroy Grumman, who had designed the Avenger while critics questioned every choice, lived to see his vindication, though he rarely spoke publicly about it. His company grew from 2,500 employees in 1941 to over 25,000 by war's end, producing aircraft that became synonymous with naval aviation excellence. The Grumman Iron Works, as it became known, developed a reputation for building aircraft that brought crews home, exactly the philosophy that had driven the Avengers' overcomplicated design. The post-war era saw Avengers continue serving far beyond their expected service life, operating with distinction through the Korean War and remaining in frontline service with some nations into the 1960s. The fundamental soundness of Grumman's design meant the aircraft could be continuously upgraded with new radar, weapon systems, and engines without requiring complete redesign. The excess capacity built into the original structure accommodated modifications that would have required new aircraft for competitors' lighter designs. Perhaps most significantly, the Avenger established principles that guided aircraft design for decades afterward. The concept that proper complexity enables capability, that over-engineering for survivability saves lives, that versatility multiplies combat effectiveness. These lessons learned through the TBF's combat record influenced every subsequent generation of military aircraft. The controversial choices of 1940 became orthodoxy by 1950, validating one designer's stubborn belief that solving problems nobody asked about would create capabilities nobody anticipated needing. December 7, 1971 marked the 30th anniversary of Pearl Harbor and found a carefully restored TBF-1 Avenger conducting a memorial flyover above the Arizona Memorial. The aircraft represented something profound about American industrial and engineering culture, the willingness to embrace complexity when simpler solutions proved inadequate, the insight that immediate criticism often indicates transformative innovation, and the understanding that the best designs solve tomorrow's problems today. The torpedo bomber that critics called magnificently overcomplicated had earned a simpler description through combat. Magnificent.